A Taste Sweet and Salty by Douglas Smith. One morning, stranger might wake on silk sheets in a fine villa in the town. Rising, he would walk onto a broad stone patio and look down over cobbled streets twisting between the red clay buildings below. Out on the Medicine, ships' sails billowed like clouds on an inverted sky. Ships he owned. He was rich. He was powerful. The next morning, he might wake naked and shivering in a dark forest, his skin painted with the dew etched by the tracks of insects that explored him in the night. He had nothing. He was nothing. Yet another morning he would find himself before the altar of the town's only church, or on a ship, or in the governor's palace, a ditch, a general's tent, a brothel, sometimes rich, sometimes poor, sometimes male, sometimes female, old, young, strong, weak, sometimes known to all, and other times, as he was ever to himself, a stranger. But always he awoke in the town that huddled under the gaze of a mountain shaped like a skull, and always, before the day had passed into the next, he had died at the hands of another. He could not remember his life before the town. Sometimes, in that space that lay between sleep and a new morning's life, he tasted it. Not a sight, or a sound, or a touch, but a taste, sweet and salty, like the memory of a lover's skin on his tongue. Then it slipped away, swallowed as this town swallowed him each night. On this particular morning he woke to breakfast smells, fried bacon, baked bread, espresso as thick as the babble of voices rising through the floor. He lay alone in a bed under cotton sheets and a heavy quilt, in a comfortable but not richly furnished room. Lifting the other pillow to his face, he breathed in the body scent and perfume of a woman. He ran a fat hand over his thick body and through thinning hair. By the time he rose and walked to the mirror on the door, he knew whose image he would see, who he would be today. He could tell that he was in the Inn of Shining Hope, and that he was therefore Jasper Rinaldi, the inn's proprietor. Staring at the fat old man before him, Stranger suddenly began to tremble. He slumped into a wooden chair, burying his face in his hands. How much longer must he endure this? With his dying breath each night, he prayed for it to end, for this death to be his last. But always, the next morning, he found himself cursed again with life. Finally he stood up. Delay or avoidance was never of use. His end would find him regardless. In living his days as if he could choose his fate was the only way he had found to feed his dying hope. He washed with a sponge in the water from a white ceramic bowl on the dresser. After putting on heavy linen pants and a shirt woven from shrub goat hair, dyed blue like his eyes that day, he went downstairs. The common room of the inn was roughly square, split into quarters by two intersecting rows of support posts. Travellers and townsfolk crowded at the long bar or sat elbow to elbow at heavy wooden tables. He stood unseen in the doorway for a moment, drinking in the bubbling soap of a dozen conversations. Then, with the tired air of an actor in a play that had run too long, he stepped into the room, weaving his way between tables towards the kitchen. And it began. A hand, calloused and sun-darkened, grabbed his arm as he passed. Stranger stopped. He looked down at Thom Fallot, a farmer whose weathered face carried a line for every crop lost over his 60 years. "You!" Thom cried. The babble in the room died to a few orphaned whispers, and Stranger felt every eye prick him like a nettle. But Thom's eyes did more than prick. They burned as they widened with the sudden knowledge that Stranger knew was awakening in Thom. "You cheated me!" Thom shouted. "You told merchants from Larinthia that my grain carried a blight. They refused to even bid, and you bought my crop for a son." Stranger said nothing. Denial or agreement, apology or explanation, no course of action had ever deflected his daily fate. He pulled his arm free and walked on, Thom's curses striking his back like knives. Thom Thoris, a flame-haired woman, tall and bony, stood up, blocking his path. "You swore that you loved me. I waited for years, turned away suitors. Now I know that you lied." Tears flowed from brown eyes where he could still see the young woman she once was. "You stole my youth. I traded a real life for empty hopes because of you." He stepped around her and kept walking toward the kitchen, but the epiphanies continued within the minds of those he passed. "You spread lies about me. You cuckolded me. I trusted you." His face calm, his eyes fixed on the kitchen door, he reacted to each accusation flung at him as nothing more than a morning greeting. But his hands were already trembling, and, inside, he was screaming. The gauntlet of recriminations finally ended as he reached the kitchen, and the wooden door swung close behind him. He stood there, breathing hard, sweat running down his back. A short woman in a white blouse and a plain brown skirt that hung to her ankles stood at the central fire, frying a fish in a heavy skillet. Her hair was long and black, and the fire's light caught streaks of grey when she turned to look at him. "Laura, her name is Laura," whispered Rinaldi's memories. "She is my wife." Her face was broad but pleasant, and the aged lines didn't show until she smiled at him, a smile that suddenly ran away and hid. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed. "My sister! With my sister! That true?" Her face twisted into a snarl as she hurled first the contents of the skillet, and then the skillet at him. He ducked both. "How could you?" The fire in her anger died as quickly as it had flared, dampened by the tears that began to flow. She slumped to the wooden floor amidst the food scraps and spills, sobbing, "How could you?" He stared at her, moved but helpless. No action of his could help. Without a word, he walked over to the bowls of food Laura had prepared, and served himself a plate of poached turtle eggs and chopped goat steak. He would keep trying to live as if he had a normal life. He returned to the common room with his food, preferring the many glares of townspeople to the singular intensity of Laura. He took a seat by a window. The summer sun warmed his skin, but did nothing to disperse the chill emanating from those around him. Looking out the window, he saw a young woman in a blue dress staring at him. Tired of accusing faces, he ignored her. Instead, his eyes traced the road out of town as it snaked up the mountainside. On another morning, very much like this one, he had set out on that road, soul-tired and heart-weary, determined to escape his cycle of doom and rebirth by escaping this town. No one had tried to stop him that day as he walked out of town past mansions that dwindled to houses that shrunk to shacks. He had hiked beside meadows where scrub hares sniffed at him above the coarse scythe grass. He had climbed through dark forests of blood cypress and devil's pine, the eyes of dread dogs tickling the nape of his neck. With the sun drowning in the sea behind him, he entered the pass crowning the mountain's skull. An hour later, he had crested the mountain and emerged from the pass to look down on what lay on the other side. Before him in the moonlight, a road had run like a silver snake down through forest and meadow, past shacks and houses and mansions, to where ships lay anchored in a harbor. The town, his prison. Stranger had stood there in the shadow of the pass for several moments, regarding the scene. Then he had walked back. If his memory served, he'd been hung that night. He couldn't recall whose life he had lived that day, or what had prompted his end. Another time he'd bought morning passage on a frigate sailing across the Medicine to Larentia. He stood on the deck watching as the pier, then the spires of the church, and finally the skull peak behind the town shrank and sank beneath the watery horizon. Even when every direction was but a line of the sea, still he had stood watching through the day, until the dying sun set fire to a scribble of approaching land marked by a mountain shaped like a skull. The frigate had anchored, he had disembarked. Later that night he had died as always. He had never tried to leave the town again. He could bear the daily replay of rebirth and death, but would not subject his last remnant of hope to that same fate a third time. He took a few bites of breakfast, chewing and swallowing, but barely tasting. No more verbal attacks were being hurled his way, so he chanced a quick survey of the room. Everywhere small knots of people sat huddled in intense conversation, with frequent glares in his direction. Trying to keep his hand from shaking as he did so, he took a sip of espresso that tasted as bitter as his mood. He might not even get out of this room. It could happen here, now. He shivered. Despite the daily repetition of his death, he had become inured neither to the pain nor the fear. To take his mind off his inevitable fate, he mulled over the accusations flung at Rinaldi, comparing them to the innkeeper's own memories of the same events. As always, he found a mixture of truth and self-deceit. Rinaldi had indeed told Larenthian merchants of a blight on Thomfolo's crop. What Thom had admitted was that the blight had been real, Rinaldi had later bought the crop, still suitable for cattle feed, giving Thom at least some income for the year. Rinaldi had profited himself, but Stranger could not decide whether the man's motivation had been to protect the potential buyers or his own personal gain. And Fawn Thoris, the red-haired woman? Rinaldi had once truly loved her, and had told her so, but that love had died, poisoned by her jealousy and suspicions, and then he had met Laura. Thom never accepted that she herself had driven him away, and had always believed that he would come back to her. Laura's accusation was different. Stranger could feel the shame and guilt in Rinaldi. It had been a moment of weakness, drunk after a fight with Laura, and her sister in a similar state during a separation from her husband. Although it had happened before he had married Laura, Rinaldi never told her, first afraid that she wouldn't marry him, and then afraid that he'd waited too long to tell her. So his guilt grew over the years, until his transgression loomed larger to Rinaldi than it should, at least in Stranger's eyes. He took another sip of espresso. Nothing new in today's awakenings. The town had taught him that people chose what truths they saw, and believed what they needed to. Each person had taken their newfound knowledge of Rinaldi's trespasses against them, and filtered it through their own self-image, using it to justify their failures, disappointments, and shattered dreams. Many in the common room began to leave, shuffling out with nothing more than some muttered oaths directed his way. From the memories of scores of other days, Stranger could sense his moment of danger passing, for now.